Follow the money. It's what we've been taught from a young age. It's what we've seen on detective shows and TV. It is a rational approach to understanding human incentive and human behaviour. As Charlie Munger said, "Show me the incentive and I will show you the outcome." This story involves incentives of such massive scale that it is hardly surprising that the information has been suppressed by the powers that be. This story provides a basis for understanding how one can rationalize crimes of chilling proportions. This story will give credence to the notion that the war on terror is nothing more than a criminal deception of the highest order. But before we get to that, we need to go back, all the way back, to the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, the treasury of the Japanese Empire was discovered
We found it.
by a staff member of General Charles Willoughby, who was General MacArthur's chief of intelligence, then known as the Golden Lily Treasure. This mass of wealth had been accumulated by the Japanese over 50 years as its armies pillaged Southeast Asia and China. It was deposited in the Philippines due to the US submarine blockade of Japan. Reports vary on the amount of gold, but it is reasonable to assume it was a fairly substantial amount. After the war, that staff member Edward Lansdale and Santa Romana persuaded Major Koji Makashi, General Yamashita Tomoyuki's driver, until he revealed and created a map of the gold sites. Lansdale briefed Assistant Secretary of War John J. McCloy about the findings, and a US cabinet-level decision was made to confiscate the gold and cover up its discovery. The gold would be added to the Black Eagle Trust Fund. It was John J. McCloy, along with the Secretary of the Navy,
Mr. Anderson,
and Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, who created the Black Eagle Trust. John J. McCloy went on to become president of the World Bank.
Mr. Anderson
Would go on to operate the Commercial Exchange Bank in the British West Indies, be convicted of running illegal banking operations and tax evasion, and be sentenced to prison. A fourth member of that group, William Wild Bill Donovan, would go on to found the CIA, distribute the gold to key banks represented by staffers, and establish AIG as a key partner in the CIA's covert operations. Lansdale and Santa Romana were made responsible for recovery of the treasure. They fabricated a communist revolution in order to confiscate the land where much of the gold was buried and proceeded to mine it. Lansdale's operation in the Philippines gave birth to most of the common features of modern covert operations for US intelligence: bribery, theft, torture, and false flag operations. It would be Lansdale that would initiate a bomb between US intelligence and Israeli intelligence. It would be Lansdale that would set precedents for the intelligence community to retain the services of organized crime on US soil. It would be Lansdale's team that would propose and justify the now infamous Operation Northwoods, the project which involved sacrificing innocent US civilians in order to rally the American people to support an invasion on foreign soil. Some say that the Black Eagle Trust was part of a covert war chest invisible to congressional oversight. The covert operations funded by the Black Eagle Trust in the 1960s and the 1970s became visible stains in the global image of the US despite all efforts to keep them undercover. In an effort to clean house, President Jimmy Carter would order the retirement of over 800 covert operatives. Many of these operatives would move into private consulting and security firms and be employed as subcontractors for covert operations. Thus began a loose association of private operatives that would be referred to as the Enterprise in the years to come. George H.W. Bush, having been director at the CIA obviously, had many acquaintances in this group and would work with them to restore their influence and control over US foreign policy and the foreign investment opportunities it created for their benefit. Unlike other presidential administrations, the Reagan administration was uniquely characterized by having the Vice President, George H.W. Bush, in control of foreign policy. This control was established in an agreement between H.W. Bush and Reagan prior to their election. The agreement was later formalized with Executive Order 12333, which also established broad new surveillance authorities for the intelligence community. As William Casey's biographer pointed out, Reagan knew little about foreign policy and cared less, and as a result, sharpies around the president took over and they ran him. One of the leading national issues during the 1980 election was the release of the 66 Americans being held hostage in Iran since November 4, 1979. The Iran hostage crisis would prove decisive, particularly President Jimmy Carter's inability to rescue and free the hostages. Reagan won the 1980 election, On the day of his inauguration, in fact minutes after his 20-minute inaugural address, Iran announced the release of the hostages. Now, some claim that the release of the hostages by Iran was deliberately delayed by negotiations led by H.W. Bush, David Kimmich of the Mossad, and Saudi businessman Adnan Khashoggi. For $40 million, the Iranians would delay the release of the hostages until after the election. Of course, that is wild speculation. Speaking of Iran, members of Bush's covert intelligence squad sold weapons to Iran, an avowed enemy of the US, and illegally used the profits to continue funding anti-communist rebels, the Contras, in Nicaragua. The entire Iran-Contra operation became public in 1986 when the Nicaraguan government shot down a US plane carrying weapons to the Contra rebels and captured a US pilot. The discovery of these shipments, a violation of US law, initiated a series of congressional investigations and an investigation by an independent counsel. Dick Cheney was one of the congressional committee members that decided that no crimes had been committed and that H.W. Bush was not involved. Robert Mueller, who as US attorney headed the Noriega, a related Iran-Contra inquiry, and the BCCI investigations, found no evidence pointing to illegal behaviour by H.W. Bush. His subsequent investigation into Enron found no wrongdoing by Enron. Mueller would later be called up to head the World Trade Center investigation. Emboldened by the lack of consequences for subverting the US Constitution and breaking international law during the Iran-Contra scandal, certain members of the H.W. Bush administration formed a group known as the Vulcans. They named themselves after the Roman god of war, Vulcan. Under George H.W. Bush, they waged war against the Soviet Union and Iraq. Under George W. Bush, they would wage war against Iraq and Afghanistan. This group included Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Colin Powell, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Armitage, and Condoleezza Rice. H.W. Bush's squad teamed up with a squad of rogue KGB officials to build a complex international network of banks and holding companies that would be used to take ownership of the Soviet economy. Over 300 of these KGB traitors who supported this operation would later be relocated to the US in the early 1990s and pensioned. The ultimate goal was pretty simple. The enterprise would provide the conditions for, let's just say, unknown Western investors to buy up much of the Soviet industry, using Russian oligarchs as frontmen to hide their staggering wealth. Periodic CIA reports to Congress would review KGB and organized crime complicity in the takeover of Russia by criminal elements, but all mention of the formidable role of the US would be expunged from congressional oversight in the public record. The first piece of the takeover involved the theft of thousands of tons of gold from the Soviet-Russian treasury. Valued at $35 billion, Soviet gold reserves were estimated to be just under 3,000 tons. Then, in September 1991, Gregory Yavlinsky, deputy chairman of the Provisional Committee managing the Soviet economy, revealed that a mere 240 tons were all that were left. 2 months later, in November 1991, even that had disappeared. According to Viktor Gerashenko, chairman of the Gosbank, the central bank of the Soviet Union, not a gram of gold remains, the vaults are empty. A key player on the Soviet side of this theft was Georgy Matyukin, a former KGB official who had been made the first president of the Russian Central Bank. After the collapse of the economy, he resigned for health reasons. Later, it was discovered that Matyukin was actually working for the CIA. The second piece was the coup. Well, the attempted coup in August 1991. The KGB was well aware of President H.W. Bush's eagerness to see the removal of Gorbachev. Many who observed the coup described it as a false coup, which was never intended to succeed. Yeltsin himself writes in his memoirs that the coup was actually a veiled pro-Yeltsin coup. The generals who conducted the coup said the same. The 1991 coup against Gorbachev was engineered by KGB General Vladimir Khrushchev. He was a business partner of the notorious spy Robert Maxwell. Shortly before the attempted coup of 1991, Maxwell met with Khrushchev on Maxwell's private yacht. A year earlier, it had been Maxwell that had initiated the dialogue about a coup with Khrushchev. In the same month as the coup, Maxwell was in Russia and received $780 million from the CIA via the Israelis to pass on to General Khrushchev. Maxwell's chief US connection was Senator John Tower, who was a longtime confidant of George H.W. Bush. It was Tower who released a statement exonerating H.W. Bush from involvement in the October surprise before the Tower Commission had interviewed even a third of the scheduled witnesses. Tower had introduced Maxwell to H.W. Bush for the sole purpose of using Maxwell as an intermediary between H.W. Bush and Soviet intelligence. Shortly after the coup, Maxwell died mysteriously on his yacht after attempting to blackmail US and Israeli intelligence.
Excuseer, dames en heren. Dus, je probeert dan terug je toekomst.
It is widely rumored that he was assassinated by either the CIA or Mossad agents in lieu of them delivering his expected blackmail payment. Maxwell's link back to H.W. Bush died just as mysteriously. Senator Tower died under suspicious circumstances in a plane crash in April 1991. Maxwell's wife was advised by a CIA agent to discourage any investigation into her husband's death if she valued her life. The audio tapes he kept of his phone calls with Khrushchev disappeared. The coup actually seems to have been a long time in the making, with Yeltsin having discussed the coup with H.W. Bush during his visit to the US in June 1991. That same summer, Yeltsin dined discreetly with the chairman of the New York Federal Reserve, Gerald Corrigan, while the rest of the Moscow mission dined with Gorbachev. The coup signaled the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the beginning of the reign of Boris Yeltsin and his family of Russian oligarchs. The next piece involved the bankers. The services of the Bank of New York and Rigsbank were required for financing and managing the money laundering of the Russian oligarchs. In 1989, Rigsbank purchased controlling interest in a small Swiss banking operation called Valmet. The new subsidiary of Riggs, called Riggs Valmet, would initiate contact with a group of KGB officers and their frontmen to start setting up an international network for moving money out of the former Soviet bloc countries. In November 1989, George H.W. Bush appears to have arranged for Anton Keel, a deputy national security advisor in the Reagan administration and a minor player in the Iran-Contra scandal, to go to work at Riggs Bank, where George H.W. Bush's brother, Jonathan Bush, was an executive vice president. Keel would head up the international banking division at Riggs. The Riggs Valmet operation, as it became known, would become the consultants to the World Bank and to several KGB front operations run by future Russian oligarchs Khodorkovsky, Konanikin, Berezovsky and Abramovich. The Riggs Valmet agents would advise the top four oligarchs on how to construct their vast money laundering schemes. In the meantime, Riggs Bank was quickly solidifying banking relations with a couple more of the old Iran-Contra scandal participants, Bruce Rappaport and Alfred Hartman. It is through this group that George Soros was brought into the fold, who then opened an assault on the ruble. Rappaport and Hartman would also extend their operations network to include the Bank of New York. It is at this stage of the operation that three more groups would be brought into the plan by Rappaport and Hartman: the Russian Mafia, the Mossad, and the Rothschild family interests represented by Jacob Rothschild. Soros and Rappaport would ensure that the Rothschild family interests would be the silent backers for a number of undisclosed deals. For instance, when Vladimir Putin sent Khodorkovsky to prison for money laundering and tax evasion, Khodorkovsky would identify Jacob Rothschild as his major silent partner and sign over his shares worth £8 billion in the oil giant Yukos to Rothschild before he went to prison. Rappaport would also introduce an American gentleman named Bob Klein to the Russians and his Bank of New York partners. Klein worked with the operation for several years, and when the feds began their inquiries into the Bank of New York money laundering scandal in the late 1990s, no one could prove Bob Klein ever existed, and he simply vanished. No one ever thought to suggest that the presence of this spook indicated that this was an intelligence operation from the very beginning. Let's take a look at what happened one day before the Catalyst event, shall we?
Pentagon, the day before 9/11, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld declared war. not on foreign terrorists.
The adversary is closer to home. It's the Pentagon bureaucracy.
He said money wasted by the military poses a serious threat.
In fact, it could be said that it's a matter of life and death.
My '03 budget calls for more than $48 billion in new defense spending.
More money for the Pentagon when its own auditors admit the military cannot account for 25% of what it already spends.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
2.3 trillion with a T. That's $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America.
Okay, so what happened at the Pentagon? Well,
at any point during this day, were you just, in a very base way, afraid?
There were many times, Miles, that you were afraid. You were worried, especially when I was standing in front of the Pentagon that night, seeing one of our fortresses pried open by a missile airplane.
A group of bankers and intelligence personnel who view themselves as a different classification of human, elite, above the law, superior to the cattle. They claim to defend the ideals of democracy, capitalism, and the American way of life while simultaneously murdering and financially enslaving their fellow citizens, or rather their subjects, in the name of national security and profit. They don't take advantage of a crisis, they create the crisis, produce industrial amounts of disinformation via their agents in the mainstream media, label talk of their actual conspiracy as a conspiracy theory, then impose a new order which enhances their power.
Our enemies are innovative and resourceful, and so are we. They never stop thinking about new ways to harm our country and our people, and neither do we.
8 years ago, this guy was on a hit list.
Budget cuts, dear. Congress blinded us overseas. I was forced to turn to any eyes and ears I could find, even if that meant recruiting the quote-unquote bad guys here.
Budget cuts? Is that what this is about? Operation Honeymoon? Fuck me. You're running a fundraiser.
Fundraiser? 1993. World Trade Center bombing, remember? During the trial, one of the bombers claimed the CIA had advanced knowledge. The diplomat who issued the terrorist visa was CIA. It's not unthinkable they paved the way for the bombing purely to justify a budget increase.
You're telling me that you're gonna fake some terrorist thing just to get some money out of Congress?
Well, unfortunately, Mr. Hennessy, I have no idea how to fake killing 4,000 people. So we're just gonna have to do it for real. Oh, blame it on the Muslims, naturally. Then I get my funding.